Did you know that in the Middle Ages a wife could be publicly shamed for nagging her husband by being forced to wear a scold's bridle, an iron muzzle designed to silence her? Or that a man could seek to dissolve his marriage if his wife couldn't bear children, a process that sometimes involved a deeply humiliating public inspection by a panel of midwives to prove her fertility or lack thereof. And get this, if your spouse suddenly revealed they were secretly related to you within what the church deemed forbidden degrees, think third cousins or even more distant connections forged through past marriages, in the family tree your entire marriage, kids and all, could be declared null and void, sometimes years after you'd exchanged vows and built a life together. Life and love in medieval times were a minefield, and when things went wrong, they went spectacularly wrong. Number 7. Oops, we're related. The awkward world of forbidden marriages. Imagine this: you're happily married, maybe a few kids. Life is chugging along as normally as it could in the medieval period. Then, bam. Someone, perhaps a nosy neighbor with a long memory, or a rival with a bone to pick, points out that your great-aunt's first husband was the brother of your spouse's grandmother. Suddenly, the church, the ultimate authority on marriage, is knocking on your door, telling you your union is incestuous and therefore invalid. This wasn't about immediate family members. Oh no! The rules of consanguinity, blood relations, and affinity, relations by marriage, were incredibly complex and far-reaching. For a long stretch of the Middle Ages, the Church prohibited marriage within 7 degrees of relatedness. Now calculating 7 degrees is a genealogical nightmare. It meant you couldn't marry anyone who shared a common great-great-great-great-grandparent. That's a vast web of people, especially in smaller, more isolated communities where almost everyone was connected in some way. Later, in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council simplified it to 4 degrees, sharing a great-great-grandparent. But this still caught many couples in its net. Why such strict rules? The Church cited biblical reasons and a desire to prevent the concentration of wealth and power within a few families, encouraging alliances between different kin groups. There was also a less understood, but perhaps intuitive, fear of problems arising from close unions, what we might now think of in terms of genetics, though they wouldn't have phrased it that way. So how did these forbidden marriages even happen? Sometimes, couples were genuinely unaware of the distant connection. Record keeping wasn't what it is today, and family histories could be murky. Other times, powerful families who wanted a specific alliance might conveniently overlook a distant relation or even seek a special papal dispensation, a kind of religious waiver, to allow the marriage, often for a hefty fee. But if that dispensation wasn't sought, or if the relationship was discovered later, especially if one party wanted out of the marriage, it became prime ammunition for an annulment. Picture the scene in a church court. Witnesses would be called, elderly villagers, family members, local priests, to painstakingly trace ancestries. Yes, I remember old man Hemlock. He was married to Agnes, and Agnes's sister's boy, that was young Thomas, whose daughter is now wed to this man's cousin. It could get incredibly convoluted. If the court found the forbidden degree of kinship proven, the marriage was declared null from the beginning. This meant it was considered to have never legally existed. The consequences were enormous. Any children from the union were suddenly declared illegitimate, which had massive implications for inheritance and social standing. The couple, now deemed never to have been married, were free to marry others, outside the forbidden degrees, of course. But the social stigma and emotional turmoil could be devastating. Sometimes, if the couple genuinely hadn't known and had lived a good life, the church might allow them to remarry after a period of penance, or might even try to legitimize the children. But this wasn't guaranteed. It was a constant source of anxiety and a powerful tool for those looking to end a marriage for other, less valid reasons. Imagine spending years building a life only to have it erased by a forgotten branch on the family tree. Number 6. But I thought we were married. The messy business of secret vows and bigamy. In the Middle Ages, saying "I do" wasn't always the grand public church affair we imagine. For a significant period, especially in the earlier medieval centuries, all it really took to be considered married in the eyes of the church was the free consent of both parties. This was known as a clandestine or secret marriage. If a man and a woman alone in a field or a tavern exchanged vows in the present tense, "I take you as my wife," and "I take you as my husband," known as verba de praesenti, they were, in theory, married. No priest was strictly necessary, no witnesses, no banns read in church. Sounds simple, right? Too simple, as it turned out, and it led to absolute chaos. The problem was proof. What if one person later denied the vows were ever made? What if one partner, having made such secret vows, then went on to marry someone else in a public church ceremony? This is where the church courts found themselves drowning in he said, she said dramas. Imagine a young woman, Alara, claiming that John promised her marriage. They exchanged vows under an oak tree, she says. John, however, has now married wealthy Matilda in the village church. Alara, possibly pregnant or simply heartbroken and feeling betrayed, could appeal to the church court. The court would then have to investigate. Were there any witnesses, however unlikely? Did John give Alara any gifts that symbolized a betrothal or marriage, like a ring or a belt? Did they live together as man and wife, even briefly? These cases were notoriously difficult to resolve. The church increasingly disliked these clandestine marriages because they created so much uncertainty and social disorder. They strongly encouraged public ceremonies, the reading of banns, announcing the intended marriage in church for 3 successive Sundays to see if anyone knew of an impediment, and the presence of a priest. But the underlying doctrine that consent made the marriage remained strong for a long time. So, if a court did find that a prior clandestine marriage was valid, any subsequent public marriage was automatically nullified. Poor Matilda, publicly wed to John, might suddenly find herself not married at all, her children illegitimate because of John's earlier secret promise to Alara. The emotional and social fallout was immense. Then there was the even more scandalous issue of outright bigamy, knowingly being married to more than one person at the same time. This was a serious sin and a crime. Sometimes it happened through deception. A man might marry a woman in one village, then travel to another and marry someone else, hoping his past wouldn't catch up with him. With travel being slow and communication limited, it was sometimes possible to get away with this for a while. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially in tight-knit communities, or if the bigamist got careless. If caught, the bigamist faced severe penance, public shaming, and fines. The church would have to determine which, if any, of the marriages was valid, usually the first one, if it could be proven. The extra spouses were left in a terrible position, their lives and reputations shattered. These disputes over who was actually married to whom filled the dockets of church courts. They involved declarations of undying love, tearful testimonies, angry denials, and communities taking sides. It highlights how crucial marriage was to the social fabric, but also how vulnerable the institution could be when vows were whispered in secret or deliberately broken. The desire for clear, public, and recorded marriages grew out of this very medieval mess. Number 5. My spouse just left. When husbands vanished and wives rebelled. Medieval society had pretty rigid ideas about how husbands and wives should behave. The husband was generally considered the head of the household, responsible for providing for his family and maintaining order. The wife was expected to be obedient, manage the household, and bear children. But what happened when these expectations shattered? What happened when a spouse just up and left? Or when a wife decided she'd had enough of being told what to do? Desertion by a husband was a surprisingly common problem. Men might leave for all sorts of reasons: to find work in another town, to go on a pilgrimage, to join an army or a crusade, or simply to escape debts or an unhappy marriage. Sometimes they intended to return. Other times, they vanished without a trace. For the wife left behind, this was a legal and social nightmare. Was she a wife or a widow? Could she remarry? For a long time, the answer was usually no, not unless there was concrete proof of her husband's death. A woman whose husband had simply disappeared could find herself in limbo for years, sometimes decades. She might struggle to support herself and her children, as her legal rights to property or to conduct business could be tied to her husband. Some brave women took over their husbands' trades or found other ways to survive, but it was a precarious existence. The church might eventually, after many years, often 7 or more, and a thorough investigation to see if the husband could be found, declare him presumed dead, allowing the wife to remarry. But the uncertainty and hardship in the intervening years were immense. Wifely desertion was less common, partly because women had fewer independent resources and faced harsher social condemnation if they abandoned their homes. However, it certainly happened. A wife might flee an abusive husband, elope with a lover, or, in rarer cases, seek a life in a religious order against her husband's wishes. If a wife deserted her husband, he could petition the church courts to order her return. If she refused, she could face excommunication. Then there was the issue of wifely disobedience, a broad category that could cover anything from refusing to perform household duties to scolding or nagging her husband, or even challenging his authority in public. While the church preached wifely obedience, daily life was often more complex. Some women were undoubtedly strong-willed and asserted themselves. However, a husband who felt his wife was too rebellious had societal and sometimes legal backing. Public shaming was a common punishment for a scold. The scold's bridle, or brank, was a horrifying metal contraption fitted over a woman's head with a plate that pressed down on her tongue to prevent her from speaking. She might be paraded through the town wearing it. Another punishment was the cucking stool, or ducking stool, a chair into which the offending woman was strapped and then dunked into a river or pond, much to the amusement of onlookers. While the ideal was a harmonious household with clearly defined roles, the reality was that medieval marriages, like marriages in any era, faced strains from conflicting personalities, economic hardships, and the simple human desire for autonomy or escape. When one partner decided to break the mold, whether by literally walking away or by metaphorically refusing to stay in their prescribed box, the disputes could be loud, public, and have long-lasting consequences for everyone involved. Number 4. It's all about the money, honey. Dowries, debts, and ducats. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just a union of hearts. It was very often a crucial economic alliance. Property, land, goods, and money were central to the marriage agreement, and when these financial arrangements went sour, so did the marriage. One of the biggest flashpoints was the dowry. The dowry was the wealth, money, land, livestock, household goods that a bride brought into her marriage. It was intended to help establish the new household and contribute to the wife's support. The size and content of the dowry were usually negotiated meticulously between the families before the wedding. Disputes could erupt right from the start. What if the bride's family failed to pay the promised dowry in full or on time? This could lead to immense resentment from the groom and his family, who might feel cheated or that their new in-laws weren't holding up their end of the bargain. The groom might refuse to fully support his wife, or might constantly berate her and her family for the shot call. There are records of church court cases where husbands sued their fathers-in-law for unpaid dowry portions years after the wedding. Then there was the question of who controlled the dowry. Generally, once handed over, the husband administered his wife's dowry along with his own property. However, the dowry was often legally considered to remain, in some sense, the wife's contribution, intended for her support if she were widowed. This was related to the concept of dower, the portion of a husband's estate a wife was entitled to upon his death. If a husband mismanaged or squandered his wife's dowry, perhaps through gambling, bad investments, or sheer incompetence, it could lead to furious arguments and deep marital strife. The wife might see her future security and her children's inheritance disappearing, leading to feelings of powerlessness and betrayal. While women's direct legal control over property was often limited, particularly under common law systems, they were not always passive bystanders. They might appeal to their own families for intervention or, in some circumstances, even to the courts if the mismanagement was egregious. Inheritance was another financial minefield. Disputes over what a wife or husband might inherit from their own families or what children from previous marriages were entitled to could poison a new marital relationship. If a husband felt his wife received less than her fair share from her parents' estate, or if a wife felt her husband was unfairly favoring children from a prior marriage in his own bequests, accusations and bitterness could follow. Stepmothers and stepfathers often found themselves at the center of these inheritance squabbles. Debts were also a common source of marital conflict. If one spouse, particularly the husband who usually had more economic agency, incurred significant debts, it could plunge the entire family into hardship. Creditors could be aggressive, and the fear of losing property or even facing imprisonment for debt was very real. A wife might resent her husband for his financial recklessness, especially if it impacted her dowry or the family's ability to survive. Conversely, though less documented, a wife's premarital debts could sometimes become a burden on her new husband. In an era where survival often depended on careful management of limited resources, financial disputes were not trivial matters. They struck at the very foundation of the household's stability and future. Arguments over who promised what, who owned what, who was spending too much, and who wasn't contributing enough were as common then as they are today, but with the added complexities of dowries, limited legal rights for women, and the ever-present pressures of a largely agrarian and precarious economy. Money, or the lack of it, could make or break a medieval marriage. Number 3. Love hurts, literally. When, for better or worse, meant black eyes and broken bones. The medieval wedding vow, for better or worse, took on a particularly grim meaning for many when it came to physical violence within marriage. While the church taught that marriage should be based on love and companionship, the prevailing social and legal norms often permitted a husband to chastise or discipline his wife physically. This wasn't seen as inherently abusive by everyone at the time, but rather as a husband's right, even his duty to correct a disobedient or erring wife, much like he might discipline a child or a servant. The key word, however, was reasonably. But what was reasonable? Therein lay the rub and the source of many horrific disputes. Some legal texts and social commentators suggested that a husband could beat his wife with a stick, but no thicker than his thumb. Others implied that correction should not result in permanent injury or death. However, these were vague guidelines, and the line between reasonable chastisement and outright brutal cruelty was frequently crossed. Church court records which dealt with marital disputes are filled with harrowing accounts of wives seeking separation, not usually full divorce, which was very rare, but a separation from bed and board due to savage beatings from their husbands. These women would describe being punched, kicked, dragged by the hair, attacked with tools or weapons, and suffering broken bones, severe bruising, and miscarriages as a result of the violence. They would often bring witnesses, neighbors, family members, even their own children to testify to the abuse they had endured. While husbands were more often the perpetrator's wife-on-husband violence also occurred, though it was less commonly reported or perhaps taken less seriously by authorities unless it was extreme. A frustrated or enraged wife might lash out with household implements or her fists. However, a husband claiming abuse by his wife often faced ridicule, as it went against the expected power dynamic. Cruelty wasn't always physical. Emotional and psychological torment could also be grounds for complaint, though harder to prove. Constant verbal abuse, public humiliation, deliberately depriving a spouse of food or necessities, or flagrant and repeated adultery committed in a way designed to cause maximum distress could all be cited in pleas for separation. For instance, a husband flaunting his mistress, bringing her into the marital home, and lavishing her with gifts while his wife and children suffered neglect could be considered a form of cruelty. The church, while upholding the husband's authority, did sometimes intervene in cases of excessive violence. If a wife could prove that her life was genuinely in danger, or that the cruelty was intolerable and beyond any notion of reasonable correction, a church court might grant a separation. This didn't dissolve the marriage bond. Neither party could remarry, but it allowed them to live apart. The court might also order the husband to provide financial support for his separated wife. However, obtaining such a separation was difficult. A wife needed compelling evidence, and there was often a high burden of proof. Many women suffered in silence, fearing further reprisals if they complained, or lacking the resources and support to bring a case to court. Social pressure to maintain the marriage regardless of the abuse was also immense. Priests might counsel wives to be more obedient or to pray for their husband's reform, rather than immediately supporting separation. The stories emerging from these medieval court records paint a bleak picture of the dangers lurking within some marriages. They reveal a world where the concept of marital harmony coexisted with a tolerance for a certain level of domestic violence, and where drawing the line between acceptable discipline and unacceptable cruelty was a constant and often painful struggle. For those trapped in truly brutal relationships, the promise of "till death do us part" must have sounded less like a romantic vow and more like a terrifying sentence. Number 2. The bedroom battleground. No baby, no marriage. In the Middle Ages, one of the absolute, non-negotiable purposes of marriage, especially in the eyes of the Church and society at large, was procreation. Children, particularly male heirs to inherit property and titles, were paramount. The biblical injunction to "be fruitful and multiply" was taken very seriously. So when a marriage failed to produce children, or when there were, shall we say, performance issues in the bedroom, it could become a massive point of contention, potentially leading to the entire marriage being dissolved. Impotence, the inability of the husband to consummate the marriage, was a recognized canonical ground for annulment. If it could be proven that a husband was permanently and incurably impotent before the marriage, and this was unknown to the wife, the marriage could be declared null and void, as if it never happened. But proving impotence was a deeply intrusive and often humiliating process. Church courts would hear testimony sometimes from both spouses about their attempts at consummation. If the husband claimed he was capable, or if there was doubt, the court might order a physical examination by physicians or midwives. In some notorious cases, the couple might even be ordered to attempt intercourse in the presence of court-appointed observers or matrons, a truly mortifying ordeal designed to verify the husband's capacity or incapacity. These proceedings were understandably sources of immense gossip and scandal. Sometimes, impotence was blamed on frigidity or even witchcraft malefice, where it was believed an enemy had cast a spell to render the husband incapable, particularly with his own wife, though perhaps not with other women, which complicated matters further. If a husband was deemed impotent, the wife could be granted an annulment, freeing her to marry someone else and hopefully have children. The man, however, faced shame and social stigma. The pressure on men to perform sexually was intense, tied as it was to their masculinity and their ability to produce heirs. Infertility, or the inability to conceive children even if consummation occurred, was a slightly different but equally fraught issue. Unlike clear-cut impotence, infertility was not usually, in itself, direct grounds for annulment if the marriage had been consummated. However, the lack of children placed enormous strain on a marriage. The blame for barrenness was almost invariably placed on the wife. She was the one who failed to conceive, regardless of where the biological issue might actually lie, something they had little way of knowing. A childless wife could face scorn from her husband, her in-laws, and the wider community. She might be accused of being cursed or of having some hidden sin. The desperation for children could lead to all sorts of actions. Husbands might openly take mistresses in the hope of fathering illegitimate children who might, in some circumstances, eventually be legitimized or at least carry on the family name in some fashion. Some men, desperate for an heir and unable to get an annulment purely for infertility, might try to find other grounds to end the marriage, such as a previously unknown blood relation, consanguinity, or alleging a pre-contract to another. The psychological toll on a woman who desperately wanted children but couldn't conceive, or who was constantly blamed for the lack of an heir, must have been immense. She lived with the constant fear that her husband might seek to set her aside. While the church technically protected her marriage, as long as it was consummated and valid in other respects, the social and emotional pressures were relentless. The bedroom, far from being a private space, could become a battleground where the future of the lineage, the marriage itself, and the personal worth of both spouses were constantly tested and judged. Number 1. Cheaters. Gonna cheat and get caught. The scandal of medieval affairs. Of all the reasons for marital breakdown in the Middle Ages, adultery was perhaps the most dramatic, the most scandalous, and the one that struck right at the heart of social order and religious morality. It was a profound betrayal of the marriage vows, a serious sin in the eyes of the church, and an offense that could tear families and communities apart. While both men and women committed adultery, the social and legal consequences often differed, reflecting the era's double standards. For a wife, adultery was considered an especially heinous offense. This was largely tied to the issue of legitimate heirs. If a wife had an affair, it cast doubt on the paternity of her children, potentially threatening the entire system of inheritance and lineage, which was so crucial to medieval society, particularly for landowners and the nobility. A husband whose wife was unfaithful faced not only personal betrayal, but also the social shame of being a cuckold, a deeply derisive term. The discovery of a wife's affair could lead to violent reprisals from the husband, and the church, while not condoning murder, often viewed such a husband's rage with a degree of understanding. Legally, a wife proven to have committed adultery could lose her dower rights, her claim to a portion of her husband's property upon his death, and face severe public shaming. This might involve being paraded through the streets, sometimes bare-breasted or forced to lead her lover by his genitals, enduring the jeers and missiles of the crowd. Fines and public penance, such as standing in a white sheet at the church door for several Sundays, were also common. For a husband, while adultery was still a sin, the societal view was often more lenient, unless it was particularly flagrant or scandalous. A man having a casual affair, especially with a woman of lower social standing, might be frowned upon but not necessarily face the same level of public disgrace or legal consequence as an adulterous wife. However, if a husband's adultery was persistent, involved bringing his mistress into the marital home, squandering family resources on her, or creating public scandal, his wife could potentially seek a separation from bed and board from the church courts. The church did condemn male adultery, but the enforcement and the severity of punishment often seemed less intense than for women, unless it was coupled with other offenses like cruelty or abandonment. How were these affairs discovered? Gossip was rampant in medieval villages and towns. A suspicious neighbor, a disgruntled servant, or a rival could easily spread rumors. Sometimes couples were caught in the act, leading to immediate and often violent confrontations. Letters, if the parties were literate, could be intercepted. The church courts heard countless cases involving accusations of adultery. Witnesses would be called to testify about clandestine meetings, suspicious gifts, or couples seen in compromising situations. Proving adultery could be difficult, often relying on circumstantial evidence, but the mere accusation could ruin reputations. The impact of a proven affair was devastating. It could lead to a legal separation, though not a full divorce. Allowing remarriage, annulment was only possible if the marriage was invalid from the start, for other reasons like consanguinity or impotence. The children of the marriage, even if their paternity wasn't in doubt, suffered from the ensuing scandal and family breakdown, property disputes would inevitably arise, especially concerning the adulterous wife's dowry or dower rights. Beyond the legal and financial ramifications, the emotional toll of betrayal, jealousy, and public shame was immense. Medieval literature and ballads are filled with tales of tragic love affairs, jealous husbands, and scorned wives, reflecting just how deeply the issue of fidelity and infidelity resonated in the medieval consciousness. It was, without a doubt, the ultimate marital dispute, capable of igniting passions and destroying lives like no other.